Well, so I think we can get going because we've got quite a few people who've actually dialed in already, ready to learn all about how they can make a difference with ethnicity pay gap reporting. I'd like to welcome you all from the Diversity Project's Race and Ethnicity Workstream. I believe we're the newest kids on the block. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bev Shah and I am the co-chair of the Race and Ethnicity Workstream, and in my other job, I am Chief Executive of City Hive. We wanted to host this event today, not to talk about the issues, because I think anyone who is involved with the Diversity Project already buys in to what's wrong and what needs to change. We wanted to give the opportunity to really look at the technical aspects of ethnicity pay gap reporting, or really any sort of pay gap reporting, because that is what we're all facing. And whether we're not facing it from the regulators, we might certainly be facing it from our clients. So we wanted to give the opportunity to look at how you can technically do this. If you can't technically do it, what are the other ways you can go about reporting this? I am joined today by my fellow co-chair from the Race and Ethnicity Workstream, Sachin Bhatia, who is also works within the institutional sales team at Invesco. I am also joined by Anthony Horrigan, CEO of Spktral, who are thought leaders in the pay gap reporting space. And we are finally joined by Mandy Kirby, who is Chief Strategist at City Hive. Mandy was responsible for the UNPRI reporting framework and a technical author of the BSI investment standard. She also sits on the data work stream of the government's Commission City of London task force to do with social mobility. So she is an expert in data collection with a mindset of how you report within the industry. A few housekeeping bits for you. We are recording because we will be sharing this. If you would like to ask any questions, please do put them into the Q&A chat box, because we will try and answer them at some point at the end, because we will keep lots of time for Q&A. In a moment, when I stop talking, I will hand over to Anthony, who will do a presentation. I have a few questions for Anthony afterwards, because that couldn't go without me talking to you, Anthony. And then we have left lots of time when Sachin will moderate some Q&A, where hopefully if you have some very sperm-based specific questions, both Mandy and Anthony will be able to answer them, whether they are regarding how you collect the data or how you report it to investment clients, anything really. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anthony.
Thank you very much, Bev. One thing I wanted to pick up straight away, completely out of the order of things, but you mentioned about what needs to change. And so the only way to make something change is to present evidence base that can support it. And I think that's the whole point about this, is that it's such a involved topic that actually not having proper evidence that you can actually show, whether it be your stakeholders, employees, or the senior leadership team, if you don't have that evidence to actually show them, it's very difficult to talk about change, because people always want to know what's the bottom line, what's happening. So that's the kind of mindset to set off with. I suppose the second thing is the health warning, which is what we're going to speak about. You won't get it right first time because it's so complicated. But the point about it is being transparent, making mistakes and actually learning from them, and telling people that you made a mistake and moving forwards is actually the only way that this can be done properly. Now, when people talk about where to start, the first thing people think about is getting the data. And that's the wrong thing to do, in my opinion. What you need to do, first of all, is to look around and assess who you are. And that starts with culture. Are we happy with who we are? Do we think we need to change? Do we want to change? What's the appetite for change? And this needs to be fully supported from the top of every organization. After you've got that straight, then you come out with a purpose. So what's the purpose of the work we're about to do to gather this information and take it forwards? Because all of this actually leads to the third most important thing, which is communicating that. Communicating the intent, the intended culture change maybe, and what it's going to mean for people and what you're trying to get out of it. Once you've got that, then you can start to actually set out and collect and validate the data. Obviously, you're not going to have the senior leadership team doing this. So this is going to be a multi kind of diverse task force that's put together that can actually do this process and report back. And remember, in the reporting, when we're talking about the communications, it's not just reporting back to the senior leadership team, it's actually reporting back to the stakeholders. And then you've got this iterative loop, which contains feedback, because you will get pushback on certain things. And there are some pretty tricky conversations that will need to be had. Again, we can talk more about this maybe in the Q&A, but I don't think I've seen or heard of any company that's done this correctly that hasn't encountered some very tricky conversations to do with ethnicity. So you've just got to be aware that that's going to happen. So in summary, starting, you've got to realize that this is just, you cannot plug and play like a lot of companies have done recently, just, you know, rub out the word gender and put ethnicity and then crack on from there. This is all about communication and keeping people informed of what you're doing and what your progress is and where there are problems and where people can help you. And very important, it's about listening and learning from people and actually being able to accept that you're not going to get it all right and that you are going to need to kind of flex around this, and it's going to be an iterative process as you move along. So as we do start to move forwards, again, every organization is unique. In gender pay gap reporting, it was really simple because on PAYE, you had people's gender. There, I think there was one paragraph in the kind of guidance from the GEO that mentions about non-binary employees and how to, you know, how to handle that situation. But all things being equal, you are going to have a list of people that you know their gender, and then all you need to do is sort out whatever pay and bonuses they get, and then you've got everything you need. It's very different when it comes to ethnicity, obviously. And the first reason is that people, you don't know that information to start with, so you need to actually find it out. One of the biggest traps that people have fallen into, and I think it was last summer, was the main, you know, kind of one of the main catalysts for this with the Black Lives Matter movement, is that people realized that they weren't doing enough and that it was pretty obvious that they weren't doing enough. And so they just leapt at it and did something. And the majority of people started to do a white versus BAME report. Now, that term, even now, according to the government, is not appropriate. I'm sure you know that it conflates race with color, with ethnicity, and actually it was only ever designed as an HR-centric term to aggregate people. It was never meant to be used in the way it's used by some people in their reports. You know, these people are BAME. That's not the way it was meant to be used. So again, it's kind of morphed over time, and it's become a term which really doesn't encapsulate what you're trying to do. The way we decided to do it was to actually look at each individual and allow them to tell us who they are. You then have to, the onus then goes on you to do the hard work to actually sort out how you're going to kind of look at the data. But in that respect, at least everybody has a voice. We read an article a couple of months ago and we saw another term called GEM, Global Ethnic Majority. We quite like it, but we will only use it when there is an absolute need to aggregate people that aren't white into a group. If we don't need to do that, we won't do it. And I think that's where the kind of flexibility comes in, which is so very different to gender pay gap reporting. It's easy, gender, male, female, done. Whereas this is very, very different. So what you will probably end up doing in the majority of organizations is looking at different groups of people as you can put them together. Why are you putting people together and not just listing each individual thing? Well, for one reason, GDPR. So if you've got people that have told you they're discrete ethnicities, it is possible, considering that in the majority of the UK working force population, it's about 14% non-white. So it is possible in, for instance, a financial services company in London that you are going to have a very small population of certain ethnicities. And by pointing out that specific ethnicity, you might be personally identifying an individual, especially if you have some kind of intersectional data point that goes with it, like their gender or what department they work in. So again, there's a lot of flexibility that needs to be maintained in this. And there are two other categories that you need to consider, because unfortunately, when you first start this process, they'll probably have more data points than these 5 listed here. And that's prefer not to say and no data. So people will either not want to tell you why, their ethnicity, and also you may not have specific data, say, on contractors or individuals like that. So it's really important to look at that kind of thing. And the most important thing is to realize that once you start to get data, what you're not going to do is run off and do pay gaps. What you're going to do is use this as business intelligence to find out, particularly, is there a department? Is there an area of the business, a location where people aren't telling you what their ethnicity is? And if so, what can you do about it? Can you talk to the director and see if a more targeted comms can be put out to actually encourage people to give you that data? But this is really good business intelligence, but you have to start thinking about how you're going to actually codify it early on. So in summary, how do you start? Well, first of all, you have to realize that every organization is unique. There is no single right way, but you do have to maintain that ultimate flexibility to make sure that you kind of flex to the situation you find yourself in. You need to describe ethnicities properly. You need to let people have a voice to tell you who they are, and then you need to feed back to them why you are in this situation going to actually group people in a certain way because of the amount of data you've got, what it's telling you, etc. Mapping it is really important to make sure you cover off all of the bases, and just constant communication. There's no such thing as too much when it comes to this. You really do need to give everybody a real sense of the journey you're on and how it's working out. So once you've done all that, now you start to think about how am I going to analyze it? Again, if we look at gender, and if you look at this picture, it's really pretty simple. A lot of organizations, the kind of average 55% man, 45% woman, and it looks relatively balanced. There are certain industries, etc., where the balance will be slightly skewed to one side or another. But mainly speaking, we're talking about 55-45, especially in financial services. In this little graphic here, when you see the orange people, they're going to be the non-white people, or the gem population, as we'll call them for now. And this is just a little insight as to why you really don't want to start doing pay gaps. So what we're going to look at here is the mean value that each of the genders gets as far as pay per hour. So £15 per hour for men and £13 per hour for women. So the way the legislation goes, that gives you a 13.3% pay gap. Slightly above the average in the UK, but not bad. And when you're talking in terms of financial services, it's pretty good. However, when you cut the data in terms of ethnicity, you can already see the shape of the data changes massively. Now you've got a huge sample on the left-hand side and a very small sample of GEM employees on the right-hand side. Now, if we do that same exercise again, and we say that all of the white population on the left get £15 an hour, and on the right-hand side, the average is £14. Actually, that gives you an even better ethnicity pay gap, roughly half of what you had for your gender. So all of a sudden, it's looking good. However, small sample sizes, as I'm sure you know, if you have a small change in a small sample, it can lead to a big change. So in this situation, we've got our £14 average. If we lose the top earning GEM employee, that can go down to 10. And just within either a month, or if you only do this once a year, your number can jump from 6.7 to 33.3%. So it's a real cautionary tale of don't just hang on to pay gap, because even when you're talking about gender, you shouldn't be talking about pay gaps. Pay gaps are susceptible to organizational size, the skewing of male and female, and they are in essence an aggregation of a whole organization down to a single number. So it's not the way to do this, and definitely for ethnicity, that is just exponentially wrong. Now, here's a complicated chart just to push home the second point about why you shouldn't just go, well, this is complicated, let's just do what everybody's done before and do white versus BAME, or as we've said, GEM. This chart shows the pay gaps over the last, from 2012 to 2018, from the Office for National Statistics. And it shows all of the different ethnicity breakdowns they've got. So let's just tidy it up. And sorry, at the moment, it's it was saying with all the factors combined, it was about a 5.8% ethnicity pay gap between white and GEM employees. If we tidy it up, we'll just look at two ethnicities inside that, and that's Black, African or Caribbean workers and Chinese workers. And you can see that there's a massive, massive difference when we cut forward to 2018. 9.2% for Black employees and minus 31.9% for Chinese employees. And what this means, in real terms, is that for every £1 the middle white employee got, the middle Black employee got 91 pence, and the middle Chinese employee got £1.32. So to aggregate everybody together, you are probably masking stories of different ethnicities within the organization. But again, the corollary of that is if you just do this and produce demographics on it and produce numbers, if you've got a particularly small population of Black, African and Caribbean employees, you may be starting to personally identify people. So again, pay gaps is not the way to do this. You need to try to think a little bit smarter how you should look at this data. So we've kind of seen the limitations of small and big sample sizes and why we really can't rely on pay gap percentages. We've also seen the need to be mindful of the changes the challenges faced by different ethnic groups, and the fact that stories may not be the same. So you need to come up with a better way to see it. And if you think about it, we can kind of go back to the first diagram, and we can think about the kind of shape of it. And what we can do is just put everybody together now and look at the actual shape of the organization. And actually this data is part of the gender pay gap legislation. It's just that it's so downplayed, people don't realize the power in it. So what's happened here is we've got our organization, we've got everybody's hourly rate of pay. And then what we've done is we've split the organization into 4 quarters, from the highest earning quarter to the lowest earning quarter. Now we can start to see the representation of different characteristics of people within the actual organization. And the first question we ask ourselves is, all right, what's a reminder? What was the actual overall representation? And remind yourselves, and it's 86% white and 14% GEM. So now graphically, without any pay gap figures, anything that can change markedly in a short space of time, you can now look at this diagram and instantly see that it doesn't look right. To have 0 median pay gap, you would have to have that representation of 86-14 in each quarter of your pay range. But you can see it's different from that. You can see that at the bottom, you've got twice as many GEM employees as you should have. And at the top, you've got only 1/3 of the GEM employees you should have. So just by one diagram, you can actually see that the shape is wrong. So now you can start to ask questions about that bottom 25%. How come we've got twice as many people as we should have? Why have people not moved up from the kind of, the lowest point up until the highest point? Where are the barriers? Where are the blocks? And again, as you know, it's going to be systems, processes, biases, potentially people, which is going to be a little bit harder to root out, but actual systems and processes, you can do quite a good job on getting to the bottom of why those kind of processes are there. And the biggest thing it comes back to is communication. Once you start to build that trust, you can actually start to ask people, for instance, why they didn't apply for those jobs, and what's the difference between this kind of employee and that kind of employee. And you can see that people will have their own biases, and may not actually put themselves forward or be in the right place to actually get put forward for promotion. So it shows you a lot just from a very, very simple diagram. So where do we actually, how do we start? Well, first of all, consider that it's very, very different to gender. Sample size is really, really important so that you don't get knocked sideways and just end up being reactive to a number that's constantly changing year on year with your employees because you haven't communicated enough, saying, this is preposterous. How come our ethnicity pay gap is 45% and our gender pay gap is 25%? You know, this is not good. You've got to be aware of masking stories of different ethnicities because it's really easily done. And you need to actually be finding, the whole point about this is getting evidence to find out why you are not driving towards a fairer organization. And the most important thing is forget pay gaps and think representation. Think in every area, why don't I have the representation that I have in the first instance inside my organization? And in the second instance, if I walk outside the front doors, what am I faced with in society? So why is my organization different to society? Again, very complex conversations to have, but having that evidence base allows you to start posing those questions. And although some of the initial answers might be really difficult, you've built up an evidence base of this is who we are, this is who we want to be, this is what's outside the door, what needs to change. So you have a nice kind of audit all the way through of what's happening. And that's me. I need to stop talking and have a glass of water.
I'm going to start talking now.
Oh no, go for it.
And also, I'm trying to resist the urge of going off piste of the things I said I would ask you. So, I mean, obviously, we've talked about communication being key and sample size, and we're an industry that loves numbers. We hang our hats on everything to do with numbers, even though they are not a guarantee of future performance. Our clients hang their hats on that as well. And one of the things, and that's a challenge for the industry, is not so much the regulation around the 250 staff members have, you know, that size of firm. It's clients asking you to report on what your ethnicity pay gap is, because they themselves work in investment organizations that are being pushed to do better via ESG. So it's kind of a well-intended push, but could end up negative. How do organizations communicate that? Because look, investment management companies can have huge amounts of assets under management, but can be quite small. And like you say, it's very obvious from the data who you're talking about if you've only got one ethnic minority. And the other thing as well is it's not maybe so much the aggregate of your whole organization, but if you're trying to build up, for example, the investment floor more specifically, or the sales team more specifically, because other areas of your business are actually okay and have, you know, how do you communicate that? Because clients will be asking, and you can't say, oh no, we're under, because I know there are some firms who will say this, but you can't say we're not bound to do this, or we're under 250, or we're too small, or how do you communicate that?
Well, thank you for that 90-part question. That was brilliant. I think the first thing, overall thing, lead by example. So that's the most important. So to cover off the first bit of that, if you're asked on a DDQ or an RFP or something to give data, you can push back on it. And what you can say is that's not the thing to do. I've just finished advising on an ESG. It's a kind of European kind of VC DDQ that they were putting together, trying to get an index, etc., how to measure. And they were asking questions like, what's your gender pay gap? And it's like, wow. So you might have somebody that's going for investment in there that's a small company, 10 people, or you might have somebody that's maybe got a couple of hundred and they're going for a Series B or something, maybe even more than that. You can't ask that question to everybody, because you could have two distinct organizations of massively different sizes, and that 10% that both of them tell you could actually mean totally different things. It could be epic for a very small company and not too good for a bigger company. So, it's about saying, okay, I know you're asking this, but actually these are the things you should be asking. So lead by example and say, this is our representation. This is what we're doing. This is how, and this is the important thing. When people see pay gaps and ethnicity pay gaps, it's time series data, just like financial markets. So you don't just look at one snapshot. And unfortunately, the government have kind of phrased it and framed it in that way that people tell you a number. Actually, what's more important is the vector. Where are you going? What's happening? What's changing? So actually giving a bit more of a specific, this is us, and actually maybe having a document ready to say, this is us, this is how we're changing and improving. So that's one thing. Secondly, as far as communicating the rest of it, if you get your communication sorted internally so that your employees know what you're doing about this, it makes it a whole lot easier, because everybody is, the old phrase, singing from the same song sheet, and all of a sudden it comes across like you've got a plan, because you have, even though that plan is probably going to be hard fought and it's going to have errors along the way, people are bought into it. So actually you start to get a reputation for just moving in the right direction. So, communication it's got to be the biggest thing, and it's got to be in both directions.
How do firms do this authentically? So I completely get, I think, and I used to be a fund selector, so I've read many a RFP, and I can read between the lines what's what's the rhetoric and then what's actually happening, because the data does back it up. Being able to point to tangible action, but how do you make sure that that's authentic and it's not, you're not just, enforcing or reinforcing diversity garnish? So you don't have a document and you've just found your one ethnic employee and you've decided they're going to be the face on it. I mean, because we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that across the board. You see social media of people claiming to support diversity, and then you go onto their website and you look at their teams, and it might be coming from a good place. You might be wanting change, but it's not enough. It's not authentic. So how do you go about making sure you are authentic? You're not just falling back on diversity garnish, and you are, going to make those changes so you can attract, in the future, talent and hold on to diverse talent. Sorry, another 90-point question.
It's good. It's good. And
it's my specialty.
It proves itself, doesn't it? This is complicated. So I think the first thing is, I've completely forgotten your question. I'm joking. The first thing is to actually realize that even, the gender pay gap, ethnicity pay gap, it is a historical view of a company. And I don't mean the fact that you measure the data and then you don't publish it for a year like most companies do. What I mean is, when you get those figures, when you see that representation, whenever that company was formed, up until that point where the data is measured, everything is gone into, making that representation. So in the first instance, give yourself a break, but own it. So that is the most important thing. Own from the top, as in, this is us. It's not pretty, but this is us. Just putting that simple message out there at least sets it out so that everybody knows, the following things may be, pretty ropey, but you're moving in the right direction. So actually acknowledging that history and the fact that, okay, we're now marking today, we are now starting to do things to improve that. And then recognizing that you can't chase a number because that's not the way to do it. You need to actually set outcomes. Maybe targets, but mainly outcomes. We need to change the way we hire people. We need to consider, coming to Mandy's area, we need to consider where we're getting our people from. There's been a lot of research, I don't know if you're aware, in the legal sector, and there are a couple of leading companies, and what they do, they've got tools that look at candidates for placements in legal firms, and they look at not the fact that they went to a red brick or something like this. What they look at is, you went to a inner city school and you got B's, but actually the average grade in that school was an E. So you have excelled in your environment. Whereas looking at somebody that went, all the way through, private schools, all the way to red brick university, you got B's, you know, or something, but actually most people got that. So actually trying to root out the actual genesis of, you know, things instead of just relying on stuff that's happened before. So this is new. So there's no such thing as, you know, it's all down on paper. Original thought is required. And the only way to make sure that's done properly is to communicate and then have a discussion about it. So it's not a simple thing. But if you're transparent and you make mistakes but admit them and say, and maybe get together a group of people and say, what are we going to do? What's best practice? What do we think is best practice at the moment? But be prepared to change it. Then that's where progress is made. Progress is never made by hiding things and, you know, obfuscating. And as you said, I love that, diversity garnish, because you can see it in the data. You can hire people. It's like when this started to become an issue, you know, when people finally realize, oh, this isn't fair for women. Well, you can helicopter senior women in, and then why are they leaving? And it's like, because the culture hasn't changed. So people are staying for a bit and then they're going, this culture's not right, and leaving. So that will happen with every form of intersectional kind of diversity. If you are not actually configured to accept it and be inclusive, then people will eventually vote with their feet.
And I think, you know, it's really important to communicate that you can't, you know, at the moment people seem to conflate diversity meaning not merit. I think there was a tech CEO at the weekend who was on an interview who said, you know, we want merit, we don't want diversity, as if you can't, you know, have the qualifications and be diverse at the same time. It was one or other, which obviously is not great to hear. And absolutely agree, contextualizing CVs, you know, if someone's gone to a state secondary perhaps and got the same grades as someone else who's gone to a private school and didn't work a second job, maybe you need to think really clearly about actually who worked harder, which we've never really done. We've, you know, in our industry, we've had organisations who proudly talked about just hiring Oxbridge. Didn't really work out that well for them, though. They're no longer around. But again, it's kind of building in that the idea of cognitive diversity. I have got one more question for you before I hand over, because I could talk to you all day, Anthony, as you know. Okay, so we've touched, you've mentioned intersectionality. You know, there's many vectors of diversity. How do we, in some way, whether it might not be the data, but bring them together? Because there's almost a sleight of hands going on if we kind of point to other vectors of diversity. If we go, no, we've done women, we'll do ethnicity, or we're not going to do ethnicity, we're going to do LGBT. If you kind of start to worry about which one, it means none of them get looked at. How do organisations make sure they're not prioritising one over the other, or, you know, how do you make sure that you're just kind of working to move forward for all forms of diversity, so we get to a point where it's really inclusive and actually we don't need to talk about diversity? Because it does feel very much like people feel that gender's done. You know, we've got some industry awards, that's great, that means gender's done, but it isn't. You know, the gender pay gap isn't moving, and yeah, maybe it's easier for people from a marketing and brand perspective to support ethnicity because of the fact that, you know, Black Lives Matter and things have become a global conversation now, which of course is very important. But how do you make sure that you kind of link all of them together? You don't do the one or other, or again, 90-point question for you, but what's the answer in 2 minutes?
Oh, right. So I suppose you kind of started to answer.
Oh, actually, before you answer that,
go on.
Also, how do you make sure you look at, for example, an ethnic woman versus a white man, for example? So bringing in, again, not lumping everyone together, but stripping out some of that intersectionality as well. So,
right. So in the first instance, the term "we," so it's got to be owned inside a company. So you do need, so if you think about it, what you're trying to change, what you're trying to do is make the company more diverse, and ultimately, actually, diversity isn't the thing you want, it's inclusion. So that actually you've got the right culture and people will just come along and be themselves, no matter what kind of diversity characteristics they have. There is an analogy. If you think it's so far broken, it's a bit like being on the wrong side of the motorway. You don't just go to the driver, we're on the wrong side of the motorway. You probably grab the steering wheel and give it a little tug and get onto the hard shoulder. So there is nothing wrong. So that's the difference between positive discrimination and positive action. There is nothing wrong with a positive action plan if it's been well thought out to actually say, we really do fundamentally need to look at, say, our board. In the first instance, if we're going to be making decisions on how we can improve diversity, and the people making those decisions are all white men, then you won't have the diversity of thought to make the right decisions. You'll get groupthink, and you'll just end up making the same things and maybe knee-jerking at some stuff that's out there that people are saying this is the best thing since sliced bread, and you won't do it right. So actually, you may have to make some sweeping kind of changes. And as long as they are positive action, not positive discrimination, then that could be appropriate, especially if you're staring down the barrel of a pension fund that's saying, you know what, we're just not, we don't really want to go near you in the future because you are just not, you're not configured correctly. So there is some initial hard kind of decisions that need to be made. And then the rest of it is an empowered task force, multidisciplinary and also very diverse, diversity of thought, to actually consider what you're doing. As far as intersectional, looking at, a white men versus black women, and is there a difference? There are so many factors there. This is where, unless you are a proper financial analyst and you've got a team of people that haven't got a day job and actually, they're going to be doing this full time, you need to be getting in some specialist help to actually make sure that you're not knee-jerking at some of those simple numbers we saw, where you end up just either aggregating one big group and then focusing on the single person and going, those two things are very different. And again, snapshots, very, very bad. You need to look at time series data and see what's been happening. And then you need to make small changes, put the little markers in the sand, and then measure the data again at a certain time later to see if that lever that you pulled, the place that you started to get people from, the fact that you stopped demanding people to be Oxbridge and started to let other people in a certain time later, and think this is not a short-term thing. A certain time later, are we still seeing, performance the same? Are those people that we've let in from other places performing as well or better than the people we got before? So it's about really getting comfortable with and using data analytics as business intelligence on an ongoing basis and to inform decisions, not just, oh, we've got to do a gender pay gap report, best we do the numbers, done. So it's a paradigm shift from where a lot of companies are to where they need to be.
There's so many things I could ask you, but I'm not going to, because I think there are other people who want to ask questions. Thank you so much, Anthony. I am going to hand over to Sachin now and put myself on mute.
Thanks, Bev, and thanks, Anthony. Well, we've had a couple of questions, and so I'll start off. I think Terry's put a few on, and I know we've touched on some of this stuff now, so I'll try not to repeat some of the conversation we've already had. But one of them is, and I've seen this as well, about firms not being able to report until they've completed detailed surveys of their staff, and then you get into the question of, and you've touched on this already, Anthony, about how big of a sample size is enough to infer any conclusions, right? And there is that balancing act of, if you have a small firm with a couple of people, was that enough of a sample size? I've seen instances where firms are carrying out that sort of information gathering exercise and until they've hit a certain threshold or a critical percentage of staff completing that, they're refusing to, or not refusing to, they're claiming that they can't really act on that data until they've had at least 60 or 70% of their workforce complete that. Any thoughts on that, and in terms of data robustness and how to balance that out with actually getting on with the task at hand?
Yeah, so I can see a website, I can see a financial services website, I can see a diversity section, and I can see a page that says this is who we are now. Instead of seeing ethnicity pay gap numbers or whatever, all I can say is, out of our employees, this is the return rate we got on the data. This is our shape at the moment. We are this percent white, this percent blah, breaking it down maybe into men and women as well, and saying we need to do more, but this is our first, we're going to tell you this. This is who we are. We know where the shortfalls are and we're on it. That is so much more powerful than just going, I'm going to wait until I've got 95%. Because the scary thing is, probably 99% of reports, gender pay gap reports, what they don't set out in their first opening paragraph, they say they're ABC limited, but actually it's not. Because of the legislation, there is a funnel that happens between the headcount, relevant employees, full pay relevant employees. So by the time you are looking at a pay gap percentage, you are not looking at ABC limited. You are looking at a subsection of those employees, because some will have been spat out due to maternity, paternity, shared parental, long-term sick, happen to the female CEO and the CFO and the CIO were all employed in this amazing company on the 6th of April. So they missed out being in the report because they weren't employed on the 5th of April. So for a multitude of different reasons, actually setting out at the very start, this is who we are. And this is actually, when you're looking at this, you're not looking at the whole company, you're looking at subsection. You can bring that forwards and use that as good kind of marketing and go, this is what we look like at the moment. This is us.
So, but I guess part of that is predicated on something you said earlier of making sure, it's not just about collecting the data, but then having an action plan in place, right? And what are the actions and what are the outcomes that you want to get? Couple of, sorry, just to keep going on the questions, because I had a few through directly as well. One of the things you touched on, it's useful for me as well, just to qualify the rule on, having, is there a legislative requirement that if you're over 250 employees, you have to collect this data? I don't know if we can just clarify that and what the threshold is, and then if it's voluntary below that, and if so, what the actual parameters are in terms of what you have to collect or can collect from legislation or versus GDPR, right? So there's that sort of making sure that you meet one without breaching the other, sort of thing.
So the first thing, if we're talking about ethnicity, there is no legislation at the moment. Okay. The consultation started many years ago now, in 2018. If it had followed the gender pay gap legislation, we would be coming up on our first deadline for reporting ethnicity. The big things that came out of it were, if you look at let's not talk about the big report, shall we say, government report too much, but basically it was a series of, sun's in my eyes, dog ate my homework, all the excuses, valid excuses with why it's not as simple as gender pay gap legislation, but no actual solutions. So we've already said that the solution is representation, not pay gaps. The fact that there isn't any legislation shouldn't stop companies from considering what's important to them. Because one thing that people don't ask themselves, or ask, when they're looking at a company, what outcome is that company trying to get to? Are you trying to instantly employ people overnight, or are you trying to change the way that you are going to consider people moving forwards? So if you set out those outcomes, then you can then start to measure them. Until you've got outcomes, this is what we want to be in 5 years' time, you can't do it. So that's the first bit. The second bit, as far as the data, we heard a lot about GDPR at the start of this process, or, going around collecting that data. GDPR. So GDPR was specifically designed for this type of work, because it is the absolute framework that should be used to make sure that you are collecting responsibly, storing it correctly, giving people the chance to withdraw their consent, giving an audit on the data itself. The 7 principles, pretty much every single one, there is a retort to anything that somebody comes up with. The only place where it starts to get tricky is that you might want to go to certain people. Say if you get to the stage where you've got 90%, but there's a stalwart 10% that won't tell you their ethnicity, you've got to be very careful, or HR have got to be very careful how they broach that, how they talk to those people, and say, can you go to a person and go, you filled in this form and you put, I don't want to tell you. So it's, again, tricky conversations, but this is where HR need to own that, because that's their speciality, being the front person for employees, and actually have those tricky conversations, and start at the top and actually say, this is why we're nearly there, but we want to be able to have an organization where everybody is quite happy to tell us who they are. We're not going to release that information, but we are going to use it.
So and look, sorry, we've had a couple of questions, and I'm just trying to keep up to date with them. But one that's come up that I've seen as well is, the intention's great, right? Getting all the data and giving the context and the comments, but actually, I know one of the hurdles that a lot of firms have and a lot of HR teams have is, and we talked about the sort of the take-up rate is actually, getting people to engage, right? And get in. You just talked about that sort of bit of prefer not to say, or people sort of, completing that box. I know, I've seen this and discussed this with people, and there is a question around getting better at the comms and explaining to people what that data is going to be used for. And also you touched on this, and Bev talked about this around explaining, the long-term aim here is to get a diverse set of people working at the firm that bring diversity of thought and better outcomes. And then, from a commercial impact point of view, hopefully, it impacts that as well. But have you seen any examples or any thoughts around, how just you can help move that dial in terms of, the intentions there, the project's underway, and actually people aren't engaging and providing information?
Just communication, more from the top, because actually what you're saying, if you take this forward to its logical, hopefully logical 15, 20 years time explanation, you will not be able to get RFP signed. You will not be able to pass any kind of DDQ unless you not demonstrate that we've got a girl on the board. But if you don't actually demonstrate that you are able to be an inclusive employer, and you do have a diverse range of people. That doesn't mean that you might not end up with a completely matching society kind of diversity portfolio. However, if you've got everything in place and it's just as easy for a Black woman or a Black man or an Asian man or a white man to join and progress through your company, because you've now got evidence to prove that there aren't those barriers that have been in the past, because they have been in the past and they are present right now. If you've got that proof, then you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
The fact that people may not apply to your company and actually make you the best in, and again, financial services love kind of benchmarking. We're not the top. It's not about that. It's about outcomes. And if the top of the organization reiterate those outcomes, it's like I saw somebody with a question about social mobility. That's even more tricky, because actually there are a series of questions you need to formulate to kind of turn it into some kind of, and Mandy, maybe you can speak about more.
That's a good segue actually.
Yeah, there you go. It needs to be some kind of index, because you've got several questions you need to ask. So again, a lot more complicated.
So yeah, for the question we had in actually was around social mobility not being a protected characteristics, but as Anthony just touched on, the complexity of measuring that. We've talked about ethnicity being complex in terms of the different, how do you splice and dice the data, but to a further level, but how would you look at sort of social mobility? So Mandy, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think you can look at the sort of process of thinking around social mobility and apply the same things as you would to other protected characteristics. And if you are going through the challenging process of collecting this data, you may as well shoot for the moon and add in this extra element. But as Anthony was saying, I mean, it is about communication, but I'd add in an extra element. It's really about building trust. So everything that you're doing with the communication is that you're building trust with people. So when you're explaining to them why you're going through the process, it's because you are building trust in the fact that you've got an objective in mind for your organization. The objective is around improving your data, improving your outcomes. But it's also about creating that inclusive environment so that people understand when they give you that information, which they may not feel comfortable doing, they know what you're going to do with it. They know that you're going to protect it from a GDPR perspective because you've got all your ducks in a row there, and you know the legal requirements, and you understand that GDPR is actually there as a way to protect sensitive data, and you're following all of the necessary means there, but also that you are going to use that data in a good faith way. So it's definitely not going to be used to single people out or identify them, but it's really linking it back to a broader corporate objective that you have identified. And if you're going to do that, then you definitely need to have signals from the senior leadership that they are fully behind this process. You need to have somebody who is accountable. So you need to have a name that people can follow this all the way to the top with. And to continue building that trust, you need to have things in place within the organization where people have a forum to speak and to contribute and to give ideas on this. And you need to be really open about once you've got even the beginnings of the data, even if you don't have the full data set in the beginning, be open throughout the process and say, this is what we've started to do, this is what we're planning to do next. And that is also really important to have, because it will allow you as an organization to fail a little bit in terms of what you're trying, because this is going to be difficult and it is going to be iterative. So you need to do quite a lot of work in the run up to this before you even ask people to start ticking boxes, to explain the narrative around the whole thing. So it's not a reporting exercise. It's a much bigger and longer term process.
And that's okay. And that's like obviously the proactive piece at the moment and where we are. What do you see on the horizon from sort of, from regulators, from the industry, or just, in terms of risk that firms face if they don't sort of, engage now? What do you see coming on the horizon potentially?
Well, there isn't anything from the regulatory perspective, certainly from the UK government. I think they've made that quite clear that it's not going to be mandatory for the moment. But that doesn't mean to say that there is enough pressure from other areas to make this a worthwhile exercise. There's definitely interest from the industry. There's definitely interest from society. And if you as an organization are interested in your longevity and attracting people and being able to retain people, then you should certainly be interested in this process. I think it's also fair to say that if you are a little bit imaginative about the way that you approach this and you use it as a good example to have a look at what's really going on in your organization, it can be a massive opportunity to have, really deep dive in terms of what's going on in different levels and different parts of your organization. It'll give you an insight into things that are working really well and also things that need to be improved. So rather than seeing it as a kind of extra additional task that you need to do, you can kind of reframe it as, this is actually part of a strategic review that we need to do as an organization in order to make sure we're still relevant in 5 or 10 years' time.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. I'm just having a look at a couple of questions that I think they follow the same theme, right? But it's around looking at how we talked before about the categorization of people into different ethnicities, and there is that balancing act of someone's used the phrase personalizing it for each firm depending on sort of the composition or the size of your workforce. But at the same time, right, you do what we're as an industry, and just generally we're always keen to sort of have some peer group analysis and look at how we're faring up versus the market. So there is that sort of I guess the argument of, should we have should there be industry-wide set categorizations, or does that not apply? Because if you've got a smaller firm with a smaller workforce, then you get into that whole issue of, can you identify people that fall in those categories? I mean, Anthony, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that. And you shared obviously some headings before around splitting up, sort of, not using BAME as a sort of catch-all term, but at the same time not getting too granular. Should there just be some sort of template in place, or some sort of, well-observed categories that everyone uses and adheres to?
So it doesn't actually, well, it kind of does, but it doesn't. It doesn't matter what you end up, if you think about it, if you're always looking at a pay gap, you're always going to be looking at 2 buckets and comparing what's in those buckets, which is quite a gross oversimplification. If you look at representation, then you can say, because we're a small firm and we have got such a small amount of people, of GEM employees, people that aren't white, actually, when we look at our representation, we're going to be looking at white versus GEM. If you then look at another firm who've got, say, a big population of Indian, Chinese employees, maybe they've got enough data there to actually look at the representation across there, and then across the aggregated group of non-white employees without those in it. So you can look at a couple of things. What you can do is, instead of coming out with a pay gap, which again, as we know, is susceptible to sample size and skewing, you can look at how your representation, a bit like the CEO pay ratio miscellaneous reporting. So you actually look and say, well, this is our average, and this is this is the white population, and then taking whatever population you want to cut it by, looking at, say, GEM employees, this is how they compare in the top third. So it's actually in quartiles, so Q1, 2, and 3. And what's the difference there? that's a much more robust way of looking at it, because you get a sense of, how does that change throughout the pay range of my organization? And you get some nice little data points, and it's only a small little table, but that becomes a much better way, instead of 10% versus 15%. So there are ways to do it, and ways to do it industry wide, but you've also got to remember that you're not doing this for the industry. You should be doing this, as you said, Mandy, to be relevant in 5, 10, 15 years time. So actually, you could say that if you just actually do the best job you can with this, then you are, benchmarking is almost irrelevant, because whatever you're doing, you're going to be in the best possible place in 15 years time. Whereas if you keep looking behind you and keep looking to the left and right at your competitors, you may be missing opportunities to get your situation better. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, there's a difference between benchmarking and maybe having groups where you share advice and actually are quite open and transparent about, this is what we found works. You don't have to share, privileged information, but just, this is how we got our return rate on the data above 80%. This is what we did. And sharing stuff like that is much more beneficial than saying, what's your number? What's your number? So I think there's a bit of a paradigm shift that needs to happen in terms of, what's the outcome? The outcome is fairness. The outcome is not a percentage. So there's just a,
yeah, no, and look, I take that on board. I think what we've touched on a couple of times is the fact that this is stuff that investors or people look at through RFPs or and so there is that balancing act, right, of there are people who will look at it in absolute terms at the data, so making sure there's some uniformity, but being able to provide as much of the background and contextualization as possible, so that they're able to appreciate actually the firm itself, the idiosyncratic issues of that make up that firm, and then looking at, okay, what does the data actually then mean, right? Rather than sort of, okay, firm X and Y and no context. And then I think your thing around the quartiles is really important as well. I think that's something that and you obviously talked through that earlier, in terms of looking at where that split is. Just conscious of time, the last few minutes. Well, one of the other things that's has come up is around, and we talked about social mobility, but just data collection as a whole. We've looked at sort of going out to the workforce on ethnicity. Should there be sort of a bigger push in the industry to just go out and collect all data, or revisit a lot of the data around ethnicity?
You've frozen, Sachin.
Should we just jump in anyway?
Yeah, I'll take over. There you go. I think you got the gist of his point. So should we just go out there and collect data for all things?
So
everything?
Yeah, step one. How about going up there and communicating why this is important? This is one of the one of the industries that's got some of the highest gender pay gap numbers, etc., representation problems. So why don't we actually start by saying, let's have a look. Research has been done. One of our kind of advisors is just about to put some very interesting research out, which is, frankly, quite damning in certain areas. And it just shows that actually, instead of collecting it to start with, that there needs to be more of a kind of, an agreement that, progress is going to be made, how it's going to be made. Again, Mandy, thank you for reading my mind with the whole point about transparency and communication is trust. The whole point about trust is about inclusion, that people actually, okay, so I can be myself. I can tell you this, and I know that it's not going to be used, for bad. There are still shocking apocryphal stories, and when I say apocryphal, they're true. People think that if they give certain information, it could be used in redundancies, et cetera, and that's shocking. However, look 100 years ago at what the shape of business looked like, and it was very, very different. Racism, it was, whatever anybody says, it's obviously not gone because it's been embedded forever. So, it's just that recognizing that actually there is a lot to be done. And in the first instance, maybe instead of collecting data, it should be owning the fact that more needs to be done and sorting out roadmap. sort of what is a good roadmap from where we are now to where we want to be, and starting on that. And then when it comes to collecting data, it's all expected. It's, you know, it's a done deal. It's going to happen because everybody's bought into it. Just setting off and collecting data straight away, you'll never get it. And if you get a part of the data, you might jump at a conclusion and steer yourself completely off the track. So it's a lot better to consider the whole process.
Just conscious of time, and everyone's been generous with the time. Just any last comments from Anthony or Mandy before we close off?
I suppose I would just encourage the people who are in a position to act and to do something on this to be courageous about it, and to use their platform and their position to take action and to help normalize the conversation around this, and normalize the starting point being we've accepted that there is an issue and we need to address it. And, you know, rather than relitigating whether or not we need to be having this discussion, just move on from there and say what's our action going to be? What are we going to do now?
Brilliant. Look, thank you everyone, firstly, for all the input, and the panelists and everyone who took the time out today, particularly with the nice weather outside, to join us for this hour. Hopefully you found it useful. Like, we had a question of whether this will be recorded. It will be recorded. We'll be sharing the link round. I guess from our perspective, and from Bev and I, and from the Race and Ethnicity Network, what we're keen to just highlight is that the diversity project has been running now for 5 years. I think there's been a great deal of good work done in terms of raising awareness around all of the issues faced, you know, in society and the industry as a whole. And we're at this inflection point where I think there's great awareness, great intention and goodwill, and it's exercises and sort of initiatives like this, where hopefully 5 years from now we're not talking about how we collect the data and how we close those gaps, but we're actually looking at all the good work that's been done sort of retrospectively. So thank you again, everyone, and thank you for everyone for taking part today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.